Her behaviour, the way she'd act like animals, for one. Finding a bird's nest and she killed two birds just straight across with stones, and I was crying my eyes out and she wasn't even asked. The mice that she had that she just stamped on.
May 24th, 2019. A terraced house in the quiet suburb of Shiregreen became the center of a case that would horrify the nation. In the early hours, police and paramedics arrived to find a scene almost beyond belief. Two teenage boys, Blake and Tristan, dead, and four younger children narrowly surviving a coordinated attempt on their lives. The perpetrators, their own mother, Sarah Barris, and her half-brother, Brandon Machin. The motive was a secret so toxic that the family's destruction seemed inevitable: fear of exposure and a desperate desire to avoid the outside world's judgment. Sarah Barris was 35 years old, the product of a troubled upbringing herself. Her family life had always been marked by chaos, neglect, and unaddressed trauma. She suffered from learning disabilities that were never properly treated, drifting through life on the margins of society. But her most dangerous secret was her relationship with Machin, her half-brother and the father of her children. The incestuous nature of their partnership cast a shadow over the entire family, a secret that both parents feared would come to light. By the spring of 2019, Sarah and Brandon's fear had grown into a constant, suffocating presence. Social services were beginning to take an interest in the welfare of the children. Rumors and questions about the true nature of the family's situation were swirling, and the couple became convinced that authorities would separate them from their children, placing the youngsters in foster care and exposing the truth behind their relationship. Instead of seeking help, they chose the unthinkable. On May 24th, the plan was set in motion. Sarah and Brandon first attempted to kill all 6 children by administering poisonous substances. When the poison failed to take immediate effect on Blake and Tristan, the 2 teenagers were suffocated, one after the other. The couple then turned their attention to the 4 younger siblings, attempting to drown them in a bathtub. By sheer luck and quick intervention, those 4 survived. The case would reveal a level of planning and calculation that stunned investigators. Sarah and Brandon communicated by text message throughout, making it clear that these were not the actions of people in a momentary panic, but a deliberate, methodical attempt to wipe out an entire family. Sarah would later admit, "I gave life and I can take it away." For her, the children's deaths were a twisted act of protection, saving them from what she imagined would be a worse fate at the hands of the authorities. Police were alerted when someone raised the alarm over concerns for the family's welfare. Inside the house, officers found a scene of devastation. Blake and Tristan, both in their early teens, could not be revived. The 4 younger children were treated for poisoning and physical trauma, but, against all odds, survived. Investigators quickly uncovered the truth. Digital evidence on Sarah's phone showed text messages between her and Brandon, mapping out their plan in harrowing detail. The trial, held later that year, shocked the community and the country. Sarah Barris and Brandon Machin pleaded guilty to multiple counts, including murder and attempted murder. In court, Barris was described as emotionally detached, offering little in the way of genuine remorse. The judge, Mr. Justice Goss, told her, "Your belief that you gave life did not entitle you to take it away." For the families left behind, the words brought little comfort. Blake and Tristan were remembered by friends and neighbors as bright, kind-hearted boys with their futures ahead of them. Their loss left what one family friend described as a huge empty void in the community. The surviving children, now living under new identities, carry scars, emotional and physical, that may never truly heal. Sarah Barris was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 35 years. Machin received the same fate. The case sparked renewed discussion about social services and the need for greater intervention and support for families on the edge. It also forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about the consequences of secrecy shame, and untreated trauma. What makes the Barris case so haunting isn't just the violence, but the motive behind it. A mother so terrified of losing her children to the care system that she chose to end their lives rather than face the truth. It is a reminder that the most profound dangers can sometimes come from within the family itself, hidden behind walls of secrecy and fear. For Sheffield, the pain lingers, a tragedy that will be remembered not only for its horror, but for the warning it sends. When fear becomes stronger than love and secrets fester in silence, the results can be catastrophic. The story of Sarah Barris is a chilling lesson in how the need to hide from judgment can destroy the very thing it seeks to protect. Rugby, England, January 2018. The town of Rugby found itself at the center of a case so disturbing that it would shake the entire nation. Louise Porton, just 23 years old, stood accused of the unthinkable, deliberately ending the lives of her own daughters, 3-year-old Lexi and 17-month-old Scarlett. The motive? A chilling belief that her children were obstacles, standing in the way of the social life she wanted for herself. Born in 1996 and raised in Rugby, Louise Porton came from a seemingly ordinary family with 2 siblings. But beneath the surface, her life was already fraught with difficulties. Early motherhood clashed with her ongoing desire for attention and romance. By her early 20s, Louise was caught between 2 worlds, her personal pursuits and her responsibilities as a mother. Time and again, she made choices that put her own needs far above the welfare of her daughters. In January 2018, this selfishness took a fatal turn. On 2 separate occasions, less than 3 weeks apart, Porton's young daughters were found unresponsive. Lexi had been hospitalized previously for unexplained breathing difficulties, and each time doctors struggled to find a medical explanation. The pattern was alarming, and after both girls died in such rapid succession, authorities began to suspect the worst. This was not a tragic string of coincidences, but something much darker. What investigators uncovered painted a picture of calculated cruelty. Both Lexi and Scarlett had suffered from airway obstruction. Evidence emerged that pointed not just to neglect, but to deliberate harm. Medical experts determined that their deaths could not be explained by natural causes alone. The truth became impossible to ignore. The girls had been suffocated by the very person meant to protect them. Porton's behavior during this period only deepened suspicion. Rather than grieving, she continued to pursue new relationships, frequently using dating apps and exchanging messages with men, even as her daughters lay in hospital beds. Social media posts documented nights out and flirtatious exchanges, with barely a mention of her children's health crises. Friends and acquaintances would later describe her as cold, detached, and oddly unaffected by the tragedies unfolding around her. But it was Louise's digital footprint that finally exposed her crimes. In the days leading up to both Lexi's and Scarlett's deaths, Porton conducted chilling online searches, questions about how long it takes for a child to die from drowning, and the mechanics of airway obstruction. These searches, made just hours before each incident, would prove to be the key evidence in building the prosecution's case. The trial gripped the nation for 5 weeks in the summer of 2019. Prosecutors described a young woman so consumed by her own desires that she viewed her daughters not as children, but as inconveniences. Louise Porton, they argued, had squeezed the life out of Lexi and Scarlett simply to free herself for the life she wanted. The jury heard how, instead of caring for her daughters, she had left them alone, prioritizing parties and fleeting romances over their basic safety. In August 2019, the verdict came down. Louise Porton was convicted of 2 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 32 years before she is eligible for parole. Judge Yip, in delivering her sentence, spoke directly to Porton's profound lack of remorse and maternal instinct. "You have squeezed the life out of your daughters for your own convenience." The words echoed the horror that had touched so many in Rugby and beyond. For the girl's father, Chris, the pain was immeasurable. In court, he asked Louise the questions that everyone else was thinking. "Why are you so evil? Were they just an inconvenience to you?" For Lexi and Scarlett, there would be no answers. Only the tragedy of lost childhoods and a family forever marked by betrayal. The case of Louise Porton is a chilling reminder of how unchecked selfishness and detachment can lead to devastating consequences. Here, the line between inconvenience and tragedy was crossed with fatal consequences. In the end, the girls' lives were taken not by illness or accident, but by a mother who valued her social freedom above their right to live. Today, Louise Porton remains behind bars, her actions a stark warning about the dangers of prioritizing self over family. The people of Rugby, and all those who followed the case, are left with lingering questions about how such a tragedy could have unfolded in plain sight, and how the bond between mother and child, so fundamental to our sense of security, could be so easily broken.
Guilty. Did you expect that?
I mean, obviously I knew that's a possibility, yeah, so it was a bit of a surprise, actually.
What made you surprised that it went that direction?
I mean, I shouldn't be surprised. No.
Idaho and Arizona, 2019-2020. A story of unimaginable betrayal unfolded across two states, rooted in twisted faith and an obsession with the end of days. Lori Vallow Daybell, once an ordinary mother, became infamous as the woman at the heart of a deadly doomsday cult, one whose beliefs justified violence even against her own children. The nation would watch in horror as the details emerged. Missing children, secret graves, and a chilling belief that family could become the enemy. Lori Vallow's story began in California, raised in Mormon communities that shaped her early worldview. Over the years, she moved through a string of marriages, each more turbulent than the last. But everything changed when she met Chad Daybell, a fringe religious author and podcaster obsessed with prophecies, the afterlife, and a coming apocalypse. Together, Lori and Chad spiraled into a world of dark visions, convinced they alone understood the battle between light and dark spirits. The cult's teachings went far beyond ordinary faith. According to their beliefs, some people could become zombies, their souls replaced by evil entities, their bodies nothing more than shells. In the eyes of Lori and Chad, these zombies could not be saved and had to be destroyed. Financial incentives and romantic obsession only tightened their bond and resolve. The most tragic consequence of their warped doctrine, the couple's own children, 16-year-old Tylee Ryan and 7-year-old Joshua J.J. Vallow, were branded as dark spirits. By late 2019, alarm bells began to sound. Extended family and friends grew worried. No one had seen Tylee or JJ in weeks. Lori and Chad spun wild stories, claiming the kids were safe and happy, but their explanations never added up. Grandmother Kay Woodcock, desperate for answers, filed a missing persons report, pushing authorities to dig deeper. The investigation spanned states, crossing from Arizona to Idaho, unraveling a web of lies and secrecy. In June 2020, the search ended in horror. Police descended on Chad Daybell's property in rural Idaho, guided by digital records and witness statements. In the backyard, they uncovered the burned, dismembered remains of both Tylee and JJ, buried in shallow graves. The gruesome discovery shattered any illusion of innocence and revealed the true extent of Lori and Chad's fanaticism. The children, once seen as beloved family members, had been sacrificed to their parents' beliefs. As the case captured international headlines, the courtroom became a stage for even deeper revelations. prosecutors exposed the couple's doomsday teachings, how they claimed to receive visions from God, identified dark individuals, and wrote about their supposed divine mission. Chad and Lori's circle of followers had grown, drawn in by their charisma and certainty. But even the most devoted were stunned by the violence carried out in the cult's name. During the trial, Lori Vallow Daybell showed little emotion. She maintained her innocence, clinging to the idea that she was following God's will. Jesus knows no one was murdered, Chad declared in his own defense, a statement that only deepened the disbelief and outrage of the public. Meanwhile, family members testified to the pain and confusion Lori's actions had wrought. Kay Woodcock, JJ's grandmother, confronted Lori in court. "I trusted you," she said, her voice shaking with grief. Ultimately, the evidence was overwhelming. Forensic experts, digital records, and witness testimony painted a picture of premeditated murder and elaborate cover-up. In May 2023, Lori was convicted in Idaho on charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and grand theft. That July, she was sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. 2 years later, an Arizona court added further consecutive life sentences for related crimes. Chad Daybell faces his own upcoming trial, still insisting on his innocence. The case of Lori Vallow Daybell became a modern cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of unchecked belief, isolation, and the seductive power of apocalyptic thinking. It exposed how ordinary lives can be upended by fanaticism, and how the bonds of family can be twisted beyond recognition. At its core, it was a tragedy. 2 young lives lost, not to strangers, but to the people meant to protect them. For the families of Tylee and JJ, the pain remains. The betrayal cut deepest not just because of the violence, but because of the faith that fueled it. The nation, too, was left to reckon with uncomfortable questions. How far will people go for their beliefs? And who pays the price when faith turns fatal? If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into true crime cases, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for more comprehensive coverage of major criminal cases.
I want to find out what's going on with all these people coming at me. And I hit his arm with the knife and then shot out of the car and ran inside. He goes, "Bitch, we're going to the bank, we're getting Russ's money." And he started getting all agitated and excited.
Missouri, 2016. In the heart of America's Midwest, a deadly scheme played out. One that would expose the chilling mind of Pam Hupp, a woman who built a life out of deception and manipulation. By the time the truth emerged, 2 people were dead, multiple families were shattered, and a community was left questioning how far someone would go to protect themselves from suspicion. Pam Hupp's story began in St. Louis, where she grew up in what looked like a typical middle-class family. Friends and neighbors saw a woman who was hardworking, ambitious, and eager to prove herself. But beneath that facade, Pam was quietly constructing a web of lies, motivated by financial gain and a need for control. She was, by all appearances, a devoted wife and mother. But as investigators would later discover, Pam Hupp's real genius was not in building relationships, but in tearing them down for her own benefit. The most notorious chapter of her story began with the murder of Betsy Faria in 2011. Betsy, a close friend of Pam's, was found stabbed to death in her own home, just days after signing over a $150,000 life insurance policy to Hupp. Despite the suspicious circumstances, Pam positioned herself as a helpful witness, casting suspicion onto Betsy's husband, Russ. Her calm testimony in court and her insistence on Russ's guilt helped convict him, only for that verdict to be overturned on appeal when new evidence came to light. By then, questions were swirling around Pam's role in the crime. It was in 2016 that Pam Hupp's elaborate deception reached its breaking point. With the Faria case still under scrutiny, Pam concocted a plan to deflect suspicion once and for all. She targeted Louis Gumpenberger, a mentally and physically disabled man, luring him to her home with the promise of quick cash. According to her version of events, Gumpenberger burst into her home, threatened her, and was shot in self-defense. But police quickly discovered holes in her story. The so-called home invasion was a setup from the beginning. Hupp had called a taxi to bring Gumpenberger to her home, staged evidence to make it appear he was a hired killer sent by Russ Faria, and planted a note on his body. Investigators soon found serial numbers on the bills given to Louis matched those withdrawn by Hupp. Cell phone records showed she had meticulously orchestrated the timing and location of every step. The inconsistencies in her narrative were impossible to ignore. When confronted with the mounting evidence, Pam stuck to her story. But the facts spoke for themselves. She had lured a vulnerable man to his death, hoping his murder would redirect the investigation away from her. The St. Charles County prosecutor described how Hupp had once demanded Russ's money at knife point in the Faria case, a chilling reminder of her willingness to use and discard anyone for her own gain. The trial was swift. In June 2019, Pam Hupp entered an Alford plea for first-degree murder, meaning she maintained her innocence but acknowledged there was enough evidence to convict her. By August, she was sentenced to life in prison without parole. She was transferred to the Chillicothe Correctional Center, where she now spends her days reportedly tutoring other inmates for their GEDs, still maintaining the polite, helpful exterior that fooled so many for so long. But the story doesn't end there. In 2025, Pam Hupp faces a retrial for the murder of Betsy Faria, as new evidence and relentless advocacy by Russ Faria's family and legal team have kept the case in the public eye. The ripple effects of Pam's actions have been felt for years, destroying families, upending the lives of children, and exposing the fragility of trust in the justice system. What makes Pam Hupp's crimes so chilling is not just the violence, but the cold, methodical planning behind them. Hers was not a crime of passion, but of calculation, each move designed to protect herself and to keep her secrets hidden. The facade of normalcy she wore was as carefully constructed as any of her schemes. In private, she valued money and security above everything, even if it meant betraying those closest to her. For the victims' families, the pain is ongoing. Betsy Faria's daughters lost their mother. Louis Gumpenberger's family was left with questions that may never be fully answered. The community, once trusting and tight-knit, became a place of suspicion and fear, a testament to the damage a single manipulator can inflict. Pam Hupp's legacy is a warning that beneath the surface of ordinary life, there can lurk extraordinary darkness. When ambition, greed, and deception intersect, the results can be devastating, not just for individuals, but for everyone who crosses their path.
And I do not feel any remorse for what I did to Stoney. So I grabbed Steven and I grabbed a belt and I put a belt around his neck and I lifted him up like, do you like how this feels?
Detroit, 2012, 2015. Behind the doors of a rundown apartment building, a secret festered for years. A secret so horrific that even seasoned investigators would struggle to make sense of it. Mitchell Blair, a mother of 4, managed to hide the bodies of 2 of her own children in a freezer, carrying on with life while horror chilled in the next room. For 3 years, her secret remained buried, until an eviction would finally force the truth into the open. How does someone manage to live a seemingly ordinary life while concealing such darkness? The answer, as investigators would learn, lay in layers of family dysfunction, trauma, and calculated deception. Mitchell Blair grew up in Detroit, surrounded by violence and instability. Her father was abusive, her mother enabling, patterns of pain that stretched from one generation to the next. By the time Blair became a mother herself, the cycle of trauma had already taken root. To outsiders, she appeared to be just another struggling single parent in a tough neighborhood. But behind closed doors, The situation was spiraling toward tragedy. The story begins with Stephen, Blair's young son. In August 2012, Blair's anger and paranoia led her to target him, convinced without evidence that he had harmed his siblings. What followed was a campaign of brutal punishment, ending in Stephen's death. Blair made a decision that would stun even hardened detectives. She wrapped her son's body and placed him in the family freezer, sealing away the evidence and her own guilt. Life went on. Blair continued to raise her surviving children, keeping up a facade of normalcy. The freezer, now a tomb, became an unspoken boundary in the apartment. For 3 long years, no one questioned the missing child. There were no visits from authorities, no welfare checks that might have exposed the truth. The dysfunction and secrecy that marked Blair's own childhood became the armor that shielded her from discovery. Then, in May 2015, tragedy struck again. This time it was Stoney, Blair's daughter. In another episode of Rage, Blair claimed again, without basis, that Stoney had harmed her siblings. She subjected Stoney to prolonged abuse before finally ending her life, repeating the same grim ritual, wrapping the body and placing it in the freezer beside her brother. The chilling gap between the two murders suggested something far more calculated than impulsive violence. The facade finally shattered on March 24, 2015. With the family facing eviction, court officers entered the apartment to clear out the belongings. What they found inside the battered old freezer would haunt them for years: the remains of Stephen and Stoney, preserved in silence. News of the freezer murders stunned Detroit and the nation, raising questions about how such horror could have remained hidden for so long. Blair was arrested on the spot, and the story that emerged was one of delusional punishment and profound psychological disturbance. She claimed that both children had engaged in inappropriate behavior with each other, a belief that investigators and experts ultimately concluded was rooted in paranoid delusions rather than reality. During her interrogation, Blair showed little remorse, instead insisting that she was the only one not lying. The surviving siblings would later describe living in a constant state of terror, afraid to cross their mother in any way. The trial was swift. Blair pleaded guilty in June 2015 to 2 counts of first-degree murder and multiple charges of child abuse. In a courtroom filled with grief and disbelief, Judge Dana Hathaway addressed Blair directly, noting the terrible fear endured by the surviving children. On July 17, 2015, Mitchell Blair was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She would spend the rest of her days behind bars, never showing true remorse for the pain she had inflicted. For Detroit, the case was a chilling reminder of how trauma and secrecy can fester in silence. The story of Mitchell Blair is not only about 2 lives lost, but also about the enduring effects of generational dysfunction, how the wounds of one childhood can be passed down, growing more dangerous with each repetition. Yet, there is a glimmer of hope in the aftermath. The surviving siblings, once hostages to fear, have since been placed in stable care. As of 2025, they are reported to be doing well, finding healing and security that once seemed impossible in the shadows of their former home. The legacy of Mitchell Blair's crimes is a warning about the dangers of untreated trauma, unchecked isolation, and the illusion of normalcy that can hide unthinkable pain. It is a story that reminds us sometimes the greatest threats are not from outside, but from within the walls we trust the most.
He came back and woke me up and he was like, "You know James is calling?" I was like, "What?" And I was like, "No, I thought he was upstairs asleep." Like, just pull off a little bit.
Just to scare him?
Yeah.
Middletown, Ohio, February 26, 2021. On a cold winter night, a small city outside Cincinnati became the backdrop to an act of abandonment and loss that would haunt a community and devastate a family. Brittany Gosney, just 29 years old, made the decision to drive her 6-year-old son, James, to a remote park, not to spend time together, but to leave him behind forever. It was a choice shaped by manipulation, desperation, and a tragic surrender of maternal instinct. Brittany Gosney's story is a familiar one in too many struggling towns. As a single mother of 3, she'd spent years moving from place to place, scraping by through evictions and periods of financial instability. By early 2021, she had entered a relationship with James Hamilton, a man who would become the driving force behind a deadly plan. Hamilton, frustrated by the demands of parenthood, pressured Brittany to get rid of the children. The idea began as talk, but it soon became action. That fateful evening at Rush Run Wildlife Area, Gosney loaded James and his siblings into her car. The children had no idea what was coming. Once at the park, she told James to get out. As she pulled away, her son, confused, frightened, desperate not to be left alone, clung to the car door. Instead of stopping, Gosney accelerated, dragging James for hundreds of feet. By the time the car came to a halt, James had suffered fatal injuries. Instead of turning to authorities or seeking help, Brittany and Hamilton tried to cover up what had happened. Together they returned home, storing James's body in their house for hours before dumping him in the cold, churning waters of the Ohio River. Days passed. Friends and family grew suspicious. Eventually, Brittany called police, claiming James had been kidnapped, a lie that quickly unraveled under the pressure of questioning. The investigation moved swiftly. Detectives noticed inconsistencies in Gosney's story almost immediately. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a kidnapping, and her behavior during questioning set off alarm bells. When confronted with the facts, Brittany finally broke down and told the truth. She had tried to abandon her son, and in the panic that followed, he lost his life. The community of Middletown was left in shock. School principal Tracy Neely remembered James as a bright light, extinguished too soon. Teachers and classmates struggled to understand how a child so full of life and curiosity could meet such an abrupt, tragic end. For many, the hardest part was the betrayal, the idea that a mother, entrusted with a child's safety, could turn away so completely. Brittany Gosney pleaded guilty in August 2021 to murder and multiple counts of endangering children. At her sentencing in September, she showed little emotion. Butler County Prosecutor Michael Gamoser said there was not one peep of sorry from Gosney as the details of her actions were laid bare. She was handed a sentence of 21 years to life, with the possibility of parole in 2042. The tragedy forced many in the community and beyond to confront difficult questions. How does someone's will buckle so completely under the influence of another? How does external manipulation overpower the instincts that are supposed to bind a parent to their child? In court, it became clear that Brittany Gosney was not a cold-blooded killer in the traditional sense, but a woman overwhelmed by pressure, poor decisions, and her own vulnerabilities, a mother who, instead of fighting for her children, allowed herself to be led down the darkest path. The aftermath of James's death has been marked by sorrow and self-reflection. His siblings were placed in the care of other family members, spared a similar fate but left with scars that may never fully heal. Friends, teachers, and neighbors still struggle with the memory of a child lost not to illness or accident, but to an act of abandonment by the person he trusted most. As Brittany Gosney serves out her sentence, her name stands as a grim reminder of the consequences of surrendering to outside pressure and neglecting the duties of parenthood. The case has fueled renewed calls for greater support for vulnerable families, better resources for struggling parents, and stronger systems to protect children at risk. In the end, James Gosney's memory endures as more than a headline. He was a boy who loved to laugh, a bright light in his school and community. His loss is a lesson in vigilance, compassion, and the importance of standing up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. The tragedy in Middletown is a sobering reminder. The safety of our children depends on the strength, courage, and commitment of the adults who are supposed to care for them even, and especially when life becomes overwhelming. Solingen, Germany, September 3, 2020. On a quiet residential street, the unimaginable unfolded. 5 children, ages 1 to 8, were found lifeless in their family apartment, a tragedy that would stun Germany and leave a community searching for answers. At the heart of this horror was a young mother, 28-year-old Christiane K., whose jealousy and desperation drove her to a crime that would haunt the nation. Christiane K. had once seemed to be living a stable, if unremarkable, life. Raised in Solingen's working-class neighborhoods, she grew up without any signs of major trauma or abuse. Teachers and neighbors remembered her as an ordinary child, and for years, she built a family of her own, 5 young children in her care, her days consumed by the routines of motherhood. But beneath the surface, things were beginning to unravel. The trigger for the tragedy was heartbreakingly simple. In the weeks leading up to September 2020, Christiane became increasingly isolated following a painful divorce. Her ex-partner had moved on, and a single photograph, showing him happy with a new girlfriend, sent Christiane into a spiral. Investigators would later struggle to understand how jealousy and grief could turn into such violence. But for Christiane, that moment seemed to mark the end of her emotional tether. On the morning of September 3rd, Christiane carried out a plan that stunned even seasoned detectives. She began by sedating her 5 youngest children, mixing medication into their breakfast. Then, in a chilling display of calculation, she systematically ended each of their lives, one by one. Only her eldest child, an 11-year-old, was spared. Christiane sent this child away to their grandmother, ensuring at least one member of her family would survive what she was about to do. The methodical nature of the crime deeply unsettled investigators. There was no sign of a sudden loss of control. Instead, the acts were deliberate and planned. Christiane later attempted to stage the scene as the work of a masked intruder, even claiming to police that an unknown man was responsible. But forensic evidence and her own digital footprints quickly unraveled that story. The alarm was raised when Christiane's mother received a message from her granddaughter, the only survivor, who had just arrived at her home. Sensing that something was terribly wrong, the grandmother immediately alerted authorities. Police rushed to the apartment, discovering the 5 children, all drugged and unable to defend themselves. Christiane herself survived a suicide attempt and was taken into custody shortly after. In the days that followed, the community of Solingen was left in mourning. Memorials appeared outside the apartment block, flowers, candles, and handwritten notes expressing shock, grief, and disbelief. Journalists from across Germany descended on the city, asking how such a tragedy could happen in a seemingly ordinary family. The trial of Christiane K. began in the fall of 2021 and revealed the depths of her jealousy and rage. Prosecutors described her actions as malicious and calculated, emphasizing how she had exploited the innocence and trust of her own children. Christiane's claim that a masked intruder was responsible quickly crumbled under scrutiny. Digital records, medication purchases, and surveillance footage all pointed squarely at her. The defense argued that she was overwhelmed, mentally fragile, and unable to cope with the breakdown of her marriage. But the sheer planning and intent behind the crime left little room for sympathy. On November 4, 2021, the court delivered its verdict. Christiane K. was found guilty of 5 counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, with no possibility of early parole for at least 15 years. The judge made it clear that her actions were a gross violation of maternal duty and trust, a betrayal so profound that it demanded the harshest punishment available under German law. For the families of Solingen, the loss was devastating. Friends and relatives remembered the children as playful, joyful, and full of life. Their absence left an unfillable void, a stark reminder of how quickly jealousy and despair can destroy what matters most. The surviving eldest child now lives with extended family, forever scarred by the events of that morning. The case of Christian K. raises disturbing questions about the boundaries of mental health support, the dangers of unchecked jealousy, and the responsibilities of parenthood. How does heartbreak turn into violence? How do we recognize when someone is at their breaking point? In the end, the answers remain elusive. For Solingen and for Germany as a whole, the story of Christian K. will never be forgotten. It is a tragedy that reminds us how quickly the familiar can become the unthinkable, and how, in the aftermath, only questions and grief remain. Euclid, Ohio, 2015-2018. In a small apartment in suburban Cleveland, a tragedy was quietly unfolding. A tragedy marked not by sudden violence, but by years of silent, systematic neglect. Sierra Day, just 24 years old, along with her boyfriend Deontay Lewis, failed in the most fundamental responsibility any parent has: to care for and protect their child. Their indifference and cruelty would ultimately claim the life of Anya Day Garrett, a 4-year-old girl whose suffering shocked even the most experienced investigators. How does parental responsibility unravel so completely? How does a mother allow neglect to replace love until the consequences become irreversible? Sierra Day's story began with struggle. Raised in Cleveland, she grew up in poverty, her own childhood marred by family instability. Her father was absent. Her mother, overwhelmed by circumstances, was unable to provide the nurturing every child deserves. The echoes of this dysfunction carried into Sierra's adult life, shaping the way she viewed motherhood and family. But none of these hardships could justify what would come next. From 2015 onward, Anya's life became a cycle of hunger, isolation, and pain. Neighbors rarely saw her. Relatives and school staff noticed bruises and odd behaviors. The warning signs were there, but Sierra became skilled at evasion, canceling appointments, avoiding questions, and manipulating the narrative whenever anyone tried to intervene. Prosecutors would later call her a master manipulator, someone determined to keep Anya isolated and the truth hidden. By early 2018, Anya's condition had reached a critical point. She was severely emaciated, her body weight and appearance more akin to a concentration camp survivor than a thriving child. Medical professionals would later testify to the extent of her suffering: extensive bruising, burns, and evidence of chronic starvation. It wasn't a single incident of violence that killed Anya, but the slow, deliberate deprivation of everything she needed to survive. The motive in this case defied easy explanation. There was no single trigger, no moment of uncontrollable rage. Instead, prosecutors described a pattern of callous disregard, an ongoing failure to provide basic care, paired with active efforts to keep Anya away from anyone who might help her. Sierra and Deontay saw the child not as someone to protect, but as an inconvenience, someone to control and isolate. On March 11, 2018, the end came. A 911 call was made from Sierra's apartment, reporting that Anya was unresponsive and not breathing. When emergency responders arrived, they found a child already beyond saving, her body telling a story of long-term abuse and starvation. The autopsy was grim, confirming what everyone already feared. Anya had died from malnutrition and neglect, with evidence of repeated, severe mistreatment. The community of Euclid and all of Cleveland reeled from the news. For those who had tried to intervene, teachers, social workers, relatives, the pain was compounded by a sense of helplessness. How had the warning signs been missed? Why had their concerns not been enough to save Anya? The story became a rallying cry for reform, a stark reminder of the consequences when child welfare systems and communities fail to protect the most vulnerable. The trial was brief but harrowing. Over 6 days, jurors heard testimony from medical experts, social workers, and family members. They saw photographs documenting Ania's condition, heard about missed doctor's visits and unanswered phone calls, and listened as prosecutors detailed the calculated steps Sierra Day took to avoid detection. The jury needed little time to reach a verdict. On March 7, 2019, Sierra Day was convicted of aggravated murder, along with multiple counts of child endangerment. Judge McCormick, presiding over sentencing, described the case as one of callous disregard for the basic duties of parenthood. Ania's father, Mikkel Garrett, stood in court and asked the question that would linger for years: how could you harm your own flesh and blood? On March 20th, Sierra Day was sentenced to life without parole, an unyielding response to a crime that left a city in mourning. The story of Ania Day Garrett is a painful reminder of the fragility of childhood and the catastrophic consequences of neglect. Her death exposed cracks in the system, but also called attention to the need for vigilance, compassion, and community responsibility. Today, advocates continue to fight for reforms, hoping that Ania's legacy will be one of change, not just sorrow. For those who remember her, Ania remains more than a case file. She was a child who loved cartoons, laughter, and life, deserving of safety and care. The injustice of her loss serves as a warning and a challenge, that no child should suffer in silence, and that every warning sign must be answered with action. Savannah, Georgia, October 5, 2022. What began as a frantic search for a missing toddler would soon unravel into a chilling tale of deception, neglect, and betrayal. Leilani Simon, just 22 years old, dialed 911 to report that her young son, Quentin, had vanished from his playpen. The city mobilized. Flyers went up, police scoured neighborhoods, and volunteers combed nearby woods and marshes. But while Savannah searched for answers, the truth was hiding in plain sight, one that would break hearts and shake an entire community. How does a mother construct such an elaborate lie, all while cameras roll and grieving relatives plead for answers? The investigation began with a mother's desperate plea. Leilani sobbed on television, urging the public for help. "My son's been through enough. I want my baby home." Behind the scenes, her story quickly began to unravel. Detectives noticed inconsistencies in her timeline, gaps in her recollection, and an absence of evidence suggesting an abduction. Those closest to the family, including Quentin's babysitter, would later testify to a long history of neglect, stories of missed meals, unexplained bruises, and troubling behavior that had been overlooked too many times. Leilani Simon's own past was marred by instability. Raised by a mother struggling with addiction, she spent much of her childhood fending for herself. The cycles of substance abuse, absence, and neglect shaped her teen years and followed her into adulthood. By the time she became a mother herself, Leilani was already fighting her own battles with drugs and unreliable partners. For Quentin, the home that should have been a sanctuary was instead a place of uncertainty and risk. On the morning of October 5th, something went terribly wrong. The full truth would only emerge after weeks of investigation, but prosecutors later revealed that Quentin had suffered blunt force trauma in the family home. Instead of seeking help, Leilani made a choice that would haunt her forever. She disposed of her son's body in a dumpster, launching a chain of events that would keep a city in suspense for nearly 2 months. The search for Quentin became a national story. Landfills were combed by hand, searchers sifting through mountains of refuse in hopes of finding even the smallest trace of the little boy. The scale of the operation was unprecedented: hundreds of hours, dozens of volunteers, and a relentless commitment by law enforcement to find the truth. On November 18th, After weeks of grueling work, Quentin's remains were finally recovered at the local landfill. The worst fears of his family and community had been realized. As the facts emerged, so did the full scope of Leilani's deception. The missing persons report, the televised pleas, the orchestrated drama, all were designed to deflect suspicion and buy time. But evidence mounted. Phone records, surveillance footage, and the testimony of those close to the family painted a clear picture of what had happened. The calculated effort to conceal the crime only deepened the community's sense of betrayal. The trial that followed was swift and decisive. Prosecutors charged Leilani Simon with 19 counts, including murder, making false statements, and concealing evidence. Testimony from Quentin's babysitter described previous injuries and repeated attempts to alert authorities, all ignored or dismissed until it was too late. The systematic nature of the neglect became undeniable. This wasn't a single act of rage, but the final chapter in a long story of indifference and failure. On October 25, 2024, Leilani Simon was convicted on all charges. Judge and jury agreed that her actions showed not just a lack of remorse, but a disturbing willingness to place blame elsewhere. Prosecutor Tim Dean captured the public mood, noting that Leilani was sorry only for getting caught. On November 21, 2024, she was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years. For the community of Savannah, and for those who had searched so desperately for Quentin, the verdict brought a measure of closure but little comfort. For many, the case of Leilani Simon stands as a warning. Cycles of addiction, neglect, and untreated trauma can cross generations, if not broken. It is a reminder of the importance of community vigilance and the need for stronger interventions when children are at risk. The failure to recognize and act on warning signs cost a young life and left a city asking how such a tragedy could have been prevented. Quentin's memory lives on as a symbol of innocence lost. In the quiet corners of Savannah, people still pause by makeshift memorials and recall the days of searching and hoping. And for those touched by the story, there is a renewed commitment to watching out for the most vulnerable, so that next time, cries for help are heard before it's too late.